Over the last 5 episodes of this podcast, we've explored the rapidly expanding use of genetic genealogy to find the identities of long-lost souls whose remains were found in Oregon. We've heard the stories of the nomadic Navy veteran Freeman Isaac Asher Jr., a young woman who liked to sing named Wanda Ann Herr, a girl who wore a pink plaid coat and mother-of-pearl ring, Anne Marie Lehman, and little Stephen Alexander Crawford. They all vanished in Oregon, but they were all also found in Oregon, their stories told, and their names said aloud once again, thanks to the help of passionate experts, their families, and advances in DNA technology.
The living families now, we have some closure.
It's a very satisfying feeling when the pieces come together just right.
Somehow I want family members to know that even though their loved ones were deceased all these years, they've always been kept safe.
I'm Regan Mertz.
And I'm Dave Killen.
This is the Unidentifieds, a podcast from The Oregonian and Oregon Live.
Freeman Isaac Asher Jr. was known for his humor, intelligence, and work ethic. He lived a nomadic life that took him from his hometown to Arizona and, eventually, Oregon.
He was a son, a brother, and an uncle. He served his country in the Navy during the Vietnam War, and he went to college in Phoenix. He would be 77 years old today.
Freeman's niece, Christina Asher Jones, can remember him singing the song Easy by Lionel Richie the last time she saw him.
Since Christina is a bit older than her other cousins, she remembers Freeman more, though her memories are faded, lost to time. Christina recalls what it was like to learn her uncle had been found.
So we hoped, but, we were kind of fascinated and excited at the same time that, there was a possibility. And then when they gave us the news, it was kind of like, oh, my gosh. So we had the hope, and then when she confirmed it, oh, my God, it was just, the closure it was good for closure, but it was also very painful because, he died out there and in the elements or whatever, exposure or something. It's just really sad. And he was young. And I couldn't sleep that night when I first knew. It's kind of like it just happened. So, and at that time, I think the last time I saw him, I might have been, I don't know, I was young, but I might have been like 17 or 18, maybe 18. Mm-hmm. And like I said, the only thing I remember is him singing that song.
Dr. Nikki Vance, Oregon's forensic anthropologist, remembers that she had Freeman's remains in her care for a long time.
She just wanted to be able to give him a name, talk to his family, and hear the stories they remembered of him.
And that was very, very rewarding. So it's not just science. It's not just genetic codes that are breaking these stories wide open. It's communication and collaboration with all of these different entities that can circle back around and really complete the circle of Freeman Asher Jr.'s life. And we were so delighted to have such a great connection with the family. We had read things on Facebook after we identified him and released him to his family that they were very grateful that all of this had happened. And as you can imagine, just being able to go to bed at night and know where he's at, not ever having to wonder again, not one more minute wondering where Freeman was.
Nikki feels that there is a stigma around the type of work that she and others do. She urges people to remember to have humanity when it comes to those working in her profession.
This is a job where people look at it and they're kind of skeptical about who goes into these types of positions or careers. And it's kind of a myth that I like to dispel because, I'm a normal person. I have a husband. I have hobbies. I have a cute dog. And, we do the same things that everybody else does. And I think TV has been strangely poor to us in depicting us as kind of antisocial and surly and just really kind of depressed and dark people. But I do this because of the humanity of it. And, and I'm sensitive to what people are feeling and how this must feel to other families. And so I really try put myself in their shoes, but I also try and use the science to the utmost degree to help these families heal by a resolution. So it's not easy every day, and it certainly can be overwhelming. But if I can remember the families and what they're going through, then I can absolutely step up to the plate and continue to work as hard as I possibly can to help these families get their loved one back.
Retired Clackamas County Police Officer Jeffrey Pape was fresh-faced on the job when he responded to the call that Freeman's remains were found near Multnomah Falls. It was a case that stayed with him for his entire career and into his retirement.
Well, it's on my mind as unfinished business from, 1979. And I'd started thinking, watching the reports of DNA sequencing and thinking, we got enough on this case to work on it. So I just figured in the fullness of time, something might come up and be nice to know before I started losing my marbles. And so
Jeffrey speculates on what might have happened to Freeman in the wilderness that day.
I'm personally convinced it was some kind of a natural death. There was a log laying there, and all the remains were on the uphill side of the log. And what we believe were his glasses were sitting on the log as if a person had sat down to take a rest and had sat the glasses there so that they wouldn't get broken if they fell asleep or something. And that's a pretty thin thread of logic, but it's what I've got. Oh, I'm thinking he got out there. I don't know if he hiked up the hill or if he'd gone up the trail to the top of the falls in Multnomah Falls and was had walked east a couple thousand yards and might have been trying to figure out a way down the hill. Don't know, but I'm kind of guessing he took a break, took a rest, and probably expired there. But there's never going to be an answer to that.
Freeman's nephew, Larry Jackson, is just content to know his uncle has been found.
Right now, like I said, since it's been almost 40 years, it's kind of closed out. He's gone. Don't know what really happened, how he died, But at this point in time, we know that we found his remains. He's buried. And we, like I said, the living families now, that are here now, we know that we have some closure.
Freeman now rests in a cemetery with a gray concrete grave marker that finally states who he was. Freeman Isaac Asher Jr., PC-3, U.S. Navy, Vietnam, March 15th, 1944 to September 9th, 1979. A cross is engraved above these words.
Wanda Ann Herr liked art and singing. She traveled around Oregon and worked on her family's farm. She was a daughter and a big sister. She had wavy brown hair and a small gap between her front teeth that showed through her smile.
She had a spattering of freckles across her face. She was found in 1986, and she would be 64 years old today. Parabon Nanolab's chief genetic genealogist, C.C. Moore, is very close to Wanda's case.
The Wanda hair case is very close to my heart. It was one of the first successful cases that we worked with Dr. Vance on. We got pretty lucky in that case. We had a handful of very workable matches. So that was a really great case to work on the genetic genealogy side of it because I had enough matches that were close enough that I could use their family trees to reverse engineer the identity of Wanda. And it's a very satisfying feeling when the pieces come together just right. And it doesn't always happen. Many times the matches that we're working with from GEDmatch have their own family mysteries. And so getting into the Wanda hair case, it was, really nice to see that these pieces were falling into place. They were coming together.
For Cece, it's a pleasure to be able to work on cases like Wanda's.
I live in California. I'm a neighbor, and my parents are from Seattle. They met at University of Washington. We used to drive up to Seattle from California just about every summer. So Oregon is close to my heart. The whole Pacific Northwest is very close to my heart. So I really love working cases in both Oregon and Washington. It's of special interest to me, I'll say. So I feel very, very lucky.
Each investigator I talked to had a different reason for getting involved in solving unidentified human remains cases. For some, it's just a job. For others, it's because they want to solve a mystery. But most said they were passionate about reconnecting families with their loved ones and telling their stories. I asked Josephine County Sheriff Dave Daniel.
And why did you want to get started in this project? Why is this important to you as a person, to the sheriff's office, and to Oregon as a whole?
Well, I think you're going to find a common thread, a common theme in law enforcement, that we're here to serve. And in that service, there's also you want to find out who's responsible. Murder charges don't ever go away. You can always be charged with a capital crime like that. But at the same time, along with that, to hold those accountable, there's the human side to it. There's closure. Somebody was missing her, and that's was the first initial driving force, to be honest with you, with a case like this. So somebody needed closure, and and we got lucky. And utilizing some of the skills and the new technologies that are out there, we were able to find Mom. And now Mom knows where Annie is.
Dave was an investigator on Anne Marie Lehman's case. Annie's parents came from Canada and England, and the family moved to Washington State in the Pacific Northwest. She was a sister and a daughter.
She was a typical teenage girl into fashion. She had a plaid overcoat, a mother-of-pearl ring with her initials engraved on the inside, and blonde highlights. She would have been 66 years old today.
Dave said that Annie's case isn't closed even though she's been identified. Investigators are still following possible leads to find out what may have happened to her. Dave couldn't tell me any more than this.
Forensic artist Joyce Nagy never stopped thinking about Annie. From the time she did her clay reconstruction in 2004 to when Annie was identified in 2018.
Annie was Joyce's first unidentified remains case, and Joyce carried this case with her for most of her forensic art career. She retired in 2022. Joyce remembers what it was like to find out Annie had been identified.
I got the phone call from the detective from Josephine County. He had already retired, but he was told, and so he gave me a phone call, and I was sitting with another forensic artist at my home, and it was so perfect to have found that out because I had another forensic artist with me who shared the joy with me, and I just started to bawl. There wasn't anything else. I was so relieved to finally get her identified.
I first talked to Dr. Nikki Vance back on May 25th, 2021. I didn't know it at the time, but we spoke on National Missing Children's Day. National Missing Children's Day has been commemorated in the United States since 1983 and internationally since 2001.
It was created by President Ronald Reagan in the mid-1980s, which were plagued with high-profile missing children cases. On May 25th, 1979, 6-year-old Eaton Potts disappeared from his New York City home on his way from the bus to school.
The date of his disappearance became National Missing Children's Day. At the time, cases of missing children rarely garner national media attention. Abduction by strangers is rare, and most missing children are missing for other reasons. But Eaton's case quickly received extensive coverage, which called the nation's attention to the issue of child abduction and the country's lack of a plan to address it.
And so to recognize the families of all missing children and adults in the nation on this day, I do like to take a little bit of time and reflect on those family members and let them know that we've never forgotten about them and their family members, and that on the other side, with these unidentified remains, I keep these people so safe. I feel like I'm their steward, and so I'm very protective of them. And somehow I want family members to know that even though their loved ones were deceased all these years, they've always been kept safe. You know, they weren't languishing out in the woods, or they're not in the ocean anymore. It's just, and that might be kind of morbid on my part, but it's one of those things that I always like to instill in families is they've been safe this whole time, and now they're in your care. And so I think ultimately I just want to encourage families to explore maybe where their loved ones might be if they do think they have someone missing in their family, and then just right after exploring that and seeing if you can find them, if they might be in a shelter, or if you know the last place where they were living. After that, if you run into a dead end, report your loved one to law enforcement. And that really gets the ball rolling as far as a case number and investigations. And then you've got a detective that's behind it, and they can continue to communicate with you. And that helps us so much, because if we know they're missing, then we'll start to look for them. And that's really the key, especially with our unidentifieds. If we know they're missing and you can tell us a little bit about them, then we can try to match them up to somebody who might be in our facility. It's about as simple as that.
And Nikki wants people to know these unidentified souls are in good hands.
I want people to understand that there are compassionate people that do this, and that we might be behind the scenes, but we are certainly working hard for the families, not just in Oregon, but around the nation. And it's comforting to me to think that message is out there. You know, what's interesting is throughout the decades, we've seen an interesting cultural shift on how human skeletal remains are treated throughout the nation. I mean, it sounds really bizarre and wholly inhumane, but just because you can put someone in a box and put them on a shelf doesn't mean they're any less human than the recognizable person that comes in tomorrow afternoon. And I think there was a perception long ago that they were somehow different. Like we could put them on a shelf and forget about them, and they're just not quite as human. I've worked my entire career to reverse that culture and to reverse that perception. And so when we do identify someone after 47 years, we treat them exactly the same way. We notify everyone in the building that there's an identification. We work with the family, with the funeral home, just as if they had come in yesterday. And so we want to pay them that ultimate respect of treating them exactly the same way as we would any other case. And that's with a high degree, again, of respect and ethics and certainly compassion. So it's been a long process, because there are a lot of hard-baked attitudes out there about skeletal remains, using them for teaching, using them as, a tool to show features. I mean, these are people. There's someone's mother, father, sister, brother, and we've never used any kind of forensic cases for teaching purposes. There's some really inappropriate things, I think, that have gone on in the past, but we have been really adamant about maintaining our level of professionalism with these remains, and that we keep them very, very much safe, very, very much confidential until we identify them. And then we just really want to shout from the mountaintop about the success, and allowing the family to grieve finally, and allowing the family to turn a corner and resolve their portion of their lives and move on.
As we've seen with all these cases, there are a lot of moving parts, and they can be expensive.
When Nikki applied for and received the $402,000 National Institute of Justice grant in 2018, it opened the door for genetic genealogy to be used for unidentified human remains cases in Oregon. Nikki believes it is the first grant of its kind.
CC Moore says that these types of cases can cost up to $5,000 to solve, $1,500 for the DNA extraction and analysis, and $3,500 for the genetic genealogy.
For most sheriff's departments, there is just not enough money to solve these cases, and the grant changed that, which is why so many cases have been able to be identified in Oregon. In the case of Stevie Crawford, there was a lot of work that had to be done just to prepare his DNA, analyze it, and get results back for the genetic genealogist to work with.
So there's this big step in between that a lot of people miss. They think you send it to a lab, you get this file, you upload to GenMatch, and you do genetic genealogy. Mm-hmm. But on many of these unidentified remains cases in particular, there's this very big in-between step where what they get back from the lab is absolutely not viable for genetic genealogy.
The organization in these old cases is often very messy. Colin Fagan was going through old boxes to digitize them when he came across the case files for Stevie, or as he was affectionately called then by investigators, Baby Doe. Had he not done that, Stevie might not be identified today.
This is the case for a lot of sheriff's departments across the country. Nikki started the Human Identification Program to streamline these cases because of an increase in interest in cases like them.
There definitely has been an increase in interest, and I think there's a lot of cold case detectives out there that are watching Oregon and the Oregon State Medical Examiner's Office very closely, because we have all 36 counties represented in unidentified cases at this point. So we're trying to identify skeletal remains from Josephine County, from Clatsop County, Tillamook, Washington County, Multnomah, you name it. All 36 counties have at least one unidentified remains case that we're working on. So we see that happening, and we have detectives starting to call us and say, hey, are you working on my case? I've got a case from 1986.
What about a case from 1963? Little Stevie Crawford's tiny body was found dumped in a remote reservoir in southern Oregon. He was only 2 years old.
He never got a chance at life, but his stepsister fondly remembers holding him when she would come home from school.
He is still loved by many 58 years later. He would have been 60 years old today. Shortly after Stevie was officially identified, Colin stopped by his grave, only this time it was different. He finally knew Baby Doe's name.
And then it's not too far from my home, and it's on a common path of travel. And so several times each year, I would turn into the Hillcrest Cemetery and walk over to the location. And I was amazed to see that what apparently strangers in the community that had an awareness because of the story being told through the media had left toys, flowers, and other things to show their thoughts and concern for this little boy. So the cemetery staff told me that over the years since 2009, it was not uncommon for them to have a collection of these things at that particular site. So it really showed me that this boy had been adopted by our community and that people, even strangers, cared.
It's been a challenge reporting this podcast from a couple thousand miles away, and I could not have done it without my editors, my sources, and the Sheriff's Department's records. I recorded over 20 hours of conversations and read through more than 500 pages of case files. It's also been impossible to keep up with the rapid, accelerating pace of identifications. Just in the time since I finished my reporting, genetic genealogy has led to major breakthroughs and several more cases involving unidentified remains or unidentified killers in the state of Oregon.
In September of 2021, Lane County Sheriff's Office officials announced they'd identified the killer of 2 teenagers in Eugene in 1977. DNA evidence and genetic genealogy led to a man named Ronald Albert Schroy. It proved he had murdered young couple Liliana Adonk and Eric Goldstrand 44 years earlier. Unfortunately, Schroy could not be brought to justice, as he had taken his own life earlier in 2021 during an unrelated domestic violence incident. Earlier that summer, Parabon Nanolabs helped find the killer of another young couple who were murdered in 1978 near Klamath Falls. Kirk Wiseman and Cynthia Freyer had been hitchhiking in the area before their bodies were found near a lake. No suspect was identified until 2019, when enough DNA was recovered from Freyer's clothing to confirm the presence of an unknown male at the crime scene. Eventually, Parabon used the techniques familiar to listeners of this podcast to identify a man named Ray Whitson Jr. as a suspect. Whitson had died in 1996, but DNA samples from 2 of his children positively identified him as the unknown male who had been present at the crime scene. Were he still alive, it would be more than enough to prosecute him, and the case has been closed. Also in the summer of 2021, unidentified remains found in 1971 in a Coos Bay marsh were finally identified as Winston Maxey III, who was only 15 when he disappeared. He had recently come to Oregon from Idaho looking for work and wasn't aware that he had fathered a child before he left. His daughter, born to a 14-year-old mother and then adopted, had been searching for him for years, and her path eventually crossed with Parabon, which had separately been tasked with trying to identify his remains. Parabon was able to compare their DNA and confirm their relationship, as well as her father's identity, but how Maxey died remains a mystery.
The breakthroughs in those 3 cases came at a rapid pace in the span of just a few months in 2021. Dr. Nikki Van says that Parabon alone has already solved 17 cases of unidentified human remains in Oregon and is working on another 30. There will be many, many more stories like the ones we featured in this podcast. Crimes will be solved, disappearances explained, and closure brought to grieving friends and relatives who have been left wondering for far too long. This was a labor of love. These cases moved me to tears more than once. Freeman, Wanda, Annie, and Stevie, you were my inspiration, and your stories will stay with me forever. And to the thousands of other identifieds out there, you too deserve to be remembered, to have your stories told.
The Unidentifieds is a production of The Oregonian and Oregon Live. Regan Mertz reported remotely from Missouri. The podcast was edited by me, Dave Killen, alongside Andrew Thien, Teresa Mahoney, and Carly Imus. Thanks to McKenna Bach for the theme music. You can find more Oregonian podcasts at OregonLive.com/podcasts. If you liked this project, give us a 5-star rating in Apple Podcasts and leave us a review. Thanks for listening.